I always knew I wasn't my father's favorite. That honor belonged to my younger brother Marcus, who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. While I spent my teenage years working the ranch, learning every aspect of cattle management and land maintenance, Marcus was off playing football and charming everyone in town. Dad never missed an opportunity to remind me that Marcus was the smart one who would make something of himself. Meanwhile, I was just the reliable workhorse who'd always be there to handle the dirty work. I told myself it didn't matter because the ranch would eventually be mine anyway. After all, I was the one who understood every inch of the property, every seasonal challenge, every financial detail. The wake-up call came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was fixing a broken gate when Dad approached with that serious expression he wore during cattle auctions. He cleared his throat and announced he was updating his will. The ranch would go to Marcus, along with all the equipment and livestock. I would receive a small cash settlement, enough for a down payment on a modest house in town. Marcus has vision, Dad explained, as if I hadn't spent 20 years proving my dedication. He'll modernize this place, make it profitable again. I stood there holding a hammer, watching my future crumble. Marcus hadn't set foot on the ranch in 3 years except for family dinners. He lived in the city, worked in finance, and had never shown the slightest interest in agriculture. But apparently that made him more qualified than me. That night I realized I needed to start planning for a very different future. Chapter 2. The New Neighbors. 6 months after Dad's announcement, our quiet rural area experienced an unexpected change. A development company purchased the adjacent property and began construction on Meadowbrook Estates, a luxury subdivision complete with its own homeowners association. Initially, we were all concerned about losing the rural character of our area. The ranch had been in our family for 3 generations, and the idea of suburban neighbors felt intrusive. Dad complained constantly about the construction noise and increased traffic on our previously peaceful road. But as I watched the perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes take shape, I began to see opportunity where others saw annoyance. These weren't just any suburban neighbors, these were HOA neighbors. And HOAs, as I'd learned from various online forums, had very specific rules about property maintenance and neighborhood standards. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was particularly strict, according to their publicly available covenant documents. They had regulations about everything from grass height to fence colors, from noise levels to unsightly property conditions. Residents had paid premium prices for their pristine living environment, and the HOA took their responsibility to maintain property values very seriously. I started taking evening walks along the property line, observing the new residents and their routines. They were exactly what I'd expected. Young professionals who'd moved out from the city seeking a country lifestyle without any of the actual country inconveniences. Little did they know that their new rural neighbor was about to become very familiar with their HOA regulations. Chapter 3. Marcus takes charge. Dad's health declined rapidly that fall. By November, it was clear he wouldn't see another spring. Marcus finally started visiting regularly, though more to discuss business matters than to spend time with our dying father. During one of these visits, Marcus pulled me aside to discuss his vision for the ranch. He planned to sell off the cattle immediately and lease the grazing land to a neighboring operation. The house would be renovated into a modern farmhouse, and he was considering subdividing some of the acreage for development. "It's nothing personal," he said, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone, "but this place is sitting on a gold mine. Dad never maximized its potential." I listened quietly as he outlined his plans to essentially erase everything our family had built. The century-old barn would be demolished. The pastures where I'd spent countless hours would be carved up into housing lots. Even the old oak tree where 3 generations of our family had carved their initials was marked for removal to improve sight lines. Marcus had already contacted contractors and real estate developers. He'd done market research on comparable properties and calculated potential profits. In his mind, the ranch wasn't a legacy. It was just an underperforming asset waiting to be optimized. What bothered me most wasn't just the destruction of our family history, but his assumption that I'd quietly accept my small inheritance and disappear. He'd already mentally erased me from the property, just like Dad had. That's when I decided it was time to become acquainted with my new neighbor's HOA regulations. Chapter 4. Research and Reconnaissance. I spent the following weeks conducting thorough research on HOA regulations and property rights. The Meadowbrook Estates Covenant was a 47-page document that covered everything from architectural guidelines to noise ordinances. More importantly, it included specific provisions about neighboring properties that could affect residents' quality of life and property values. The HOA had the authority to file complaints with the county about properties that violated zoning regulations, created noise disturbances, or posed environmental hazards. They could also petition for stricter enforcement of existing agricultural regulations and request inspections of neighboring properties. I discovered that our ranch, while grandfathered under agricultural zoning, was still subject to certain county regulations that hadn't been strictly enforced in decades. These included requirements for proper waste management, noise control during specific hours, and maintenance of structures visible from public roads. I also learned that the HOA held monthly meetings where residents could voice concerns about neighborhood issues. These meetings were open to the public, and non-residents could speak during designated comment periods. Armed with this information, I began documenting every aspect of our ranch operation that might be considered problematic by suburban standards. The early morning rooster calls, the occasional cattle truck deliveries, the aging barn with peeling paint visible from the road, all potential ammunition for concerned homeowners. I also started building relationships with some of the Meadowbrook residents during my evening walks. Most were friendly enough, though several mentioned their concerns about living next to an active farm operation. The groundwork was being laid for what would come next. Chapter 5. The funeral and the Will Dad passed away on a cold January morning. The funeral was well attended, with neighbors and fellow ranchers sharing stories about his decades of community involvement. Marcus gave a touching eulogy about Dad's legacy and the importance of preserving family traditions. The irony wasn't lost on me. The will reading took place the following week in our family attorney's office. As expected, Marcus inherited the ranch, the livestock, and all equipment. I received $50,000 and Dad's old pickup truck. Marcus also inherited all of Dad's debts, including the mortgage balance and several equipment loans. What Marcus hadn't anticipated was the ranch's current financial situation. Dad had been struggling for years, taking out loans against the property to cover operating expenses and medical bills. The ranch was profitable enough to sustain itself, but only with careful management and deep knowledge of its operation. Marcus seemed confident he could handle these challenges, especially once he implemented his modernization plans. He'd already scheduled meetings with potential buyers for the cattle and had contractors lined up to begin renovations. I helped him with the initial transition, showing him the locations of important documents and explaining the basics of our current operations. He listened with the distracted attention of someone who planned to change everything anyway. Within a month, I'd moved into a small apartment in town and started working for a neighboring ranch. Marcus took possession of our family property, eager to begin his transformation. That's when I decided it was time to attend my first Meadowbrook Estates HOA meeting. Chapter 6. First Contact. The February HOA meeting was held in the community center of Meadowbrook Estates. About 30 residents attended, mostly discussing routine matters like snow removal and upcoming landscaping projects. I sat quietly in the back, observing the group dynamics and taking notes. During the open comment period, I introduced myself as a longtime area resident and expressed my appreciation for their commitment to maintaining neighborhood standards. I mentioned that I'd recently moved to town but still worked in agriculture and was familiar with the challenges of balancing rural and suburban interests. Several residents approached me afterward, curious about my background and eager to discuss their concerns about living next to an active ranch. They were particularly worried about property values and the potential for agricultural operations to create noise, odors, or traffic issues. I listened sympathetically, sharing my understanding of their concerns while subtly gathering information about their specific complaints. Some mentioned being awakened by early morning farm activities. Others worried about the appearance of aging agricultural buildings visible from their properties. I assured them that most ranchers were good neighbors who tried to be considerate of nearby residents. However, I also mentioned that agricultural operations were subject to various regulations, and concerned citizens always had the right to ensure these regulations were being followed. I left that meeting with a clear understanding of the residents' priorities and concern. More importantly, I had established myself as a knowledgeable and sympathetic ally who understood both agricultural operations and suburban expectations. The foundation for my campaign was now in place. Chapter 7. The complaints begin. Marcus's first month as ranch owner was challenging but manageable. He'd successfully sold most of the cattle and was negotiating lease agreements for the grazing land. The renovation contractors had begun their initial assessments, and he was optimistic about his timeline. That's when the complaints started. The first came from the county zoning office, responding to concerns raised by neighboring residents about early morning noise from agricultural activities. Marcus was informed that while agricultural operations were permitted, they must comply with county noise ordinances, particularly regarding activities before 7 a.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. on weekends. This was problematic because our ranch had always operated on a dawn-to-dusk schedule, with feeding and maintenance activities beginning well before sunrise. Marcus had maintained these routines without considering the noise implications for his new suburban neighbors. The second complaint involved the appearance of several outbuildings visible from the road. The county received reports that these structures were in disrepair and potentially unsafe. An inspector was scheduled to assess their condition and determine if they met current building codes. Marcus was frustrated but not overly concerned. He planned to demolish most of these buildings anyway as part of his renovation project. However, the inspection process would require him to either bring the structures up to code or obtain demolition permits, both expensive and time-consuming options. I watched these developments with interest during my weekly visits to help with the transition. Marcus seemed confident he could handle these minor bureaucratic hassles, but I could see the stress beginning to affect him. The complaints were just getting started. Chapter 8. Escalation. By March, the complaints had intensified significantly. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had formed a Rural Relations Committee, specifically to address concerns about neighboring agricultural properties. They'd hired a consultant to review county regulations and identify potential violations. Marcus received notices about improper waste management after residents complained about odors from the compost area near the barn. The county required him to relocate the composting operation and install proper containment measures, a $15,000 expense he hadn't budgeted for. Additional complaints targeted the condition of fencing along the property line, the storage of agricultural equipment visible from the road, and the presence of vermin, actually barn cats, that were allegedly threatening neighborhood pets. Each complaint triggered inspections, paperwork, and potential fines. Marcus found himself spending more time dealing with regulatory issues than implementing his renovation plans. The contractors he'd hired were frustrated by delays and began charging additional fees for schedule changes. Meanwhile, I continued attending HOA meetings, expressing sympathy for residents' concerns while providing helpful information about agricultural regulations and complaint procedures. I'd become a trusted resource for neighbors who wanted to ensure their quality of life was protected. Marcus began to suspect that the complaints were coordinated, but he couldn't prove anything. He accused me of stirring up trouble during one of our conversations, but I reminded him that I was just trying to help him navigate the challenges of ranch ownership. "Maybe Dad was right about you," he said angrily. "You never could handle responsibility." I just smiled and offered to help him research compliance solutions. Chapter 9. Financial pressure. The regulatory compliance costs were mounting faster than Marcus had anticipated. Between fines, required improvements, and legal fees for fighting questionable violations, he'd already spent most of his available cash reserves. The ranch's income had also decreased significantly since he'd sold the cattle. The grazing lease payments wouldn't begin until spring, and the renovation project was on hold due to permitting delays caused by ongoing complaints. Marcus tried to secure additional financing, but banks were hesitant to lend against a property with active code violations and pending regulatory issues. His credit was good, but the ranch's debt-to-equity ratio was already concerning, and the compliance costs represented unknown future liabilities. I offered to help him develop a compliance strategy, drawing on my years of experience with agricultural regulations. We spent several evenings reviewing county codes and developing cost estimates for bringing the property into full compliance. The numbers were sobering. Full compliance would cost approximately $75,000, not including ongoing maintenance and monitoring expenses. Marcus would need to take out a significant loan against the property, which would substantially increase his monthly payments. "This is insane," he said, staring at the spreadsheet we'd created. Dad never dealt with any of this. I reminded him that Dad had operated under different circumstances, with fewer suburban neighbors and less stringent enforcement. Times had changed, and successful ranch management now required navigating complex regulatory environments. Marcus was beginning to understand that ranch ownership involved more than just collecting lease payments and planning renovations. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. By April, Marcus was drowning in regulatory requirements and compliance costs. The HOA's Rural Relations Committee had expanded their scope, filing complaints about everything from dust generated by farm vehicles to the industrial appearance of agricultural equipment storage. The county had issued a comprehensive violation notice requiring Marcus to address 17 separate issues within 60 days or face escalating fines. The estimated compliance cost had grown to over $100,000, and several violations required ongoing monitoring and maintenance. Marcus's renovation plans were completely stalled. Contractors had withdrawn their bids due to uncertainty about the property's regulatory status, and potential buyers for development parcels were concerned about the compliance issues affecting the entire property. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. Marcus had already borrowed against his city property to cover initial compliance costs, and his monthly expenses now exceeded his income. The ranch was generating minimal revenue while consuming massive amounts of cash. During one particularly stressful evening, Marcus broke down and admitted he was in over his head. He'd never anticipated the complexity of agricultural property management or the costs associated with regulatory compliance. "I thought this would be simple," he said, holding his head in his hands. "Sell the cattle, fix up the house, maybe develop some lots. I never imagined dealing with all this bureaucratic nonsense." I listened sympathetically while he vented his frustrations. Then I made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Chapter 11. The proposal I offered to buy the ranch from Marcus for $200,000, enough to cover his debts and provide a modest profit. It was significantly less than the property's theoretical value, but given the current regulatory challenges and compliance costs, it represented a reasonable market price. Marcus was initially resistant, viewing the offer as inadequate compensation for his inheritance. However, as we reviewed his financial situation and the ongoing compliance requirements, the wisdom of cutting his losses became apparent. I explained that I had the agricultural experience necessary to manage the regulatory challenges efficiently. Many of the violations could be addressed through operational changes rather than expensive infrastructure improvements. My knowledge of farming practices and relationships with county officials would allow me to resolve issues that seemed insurmountable to someone without agricultural background. Furthermore, I was prepared to take over all existing debts and compliance obligations, relieving Marcus of ongoing liability for regulatory issues. He would walk away with cash and no further responsibility for the property's problems. Marcus spent several days considering the offer, consulting with attorneys and financial advisors. The consensus was clear. Continuing to own the ranch would likely result in bankruptcy, while selling would allow him to recover some value and move on with his life. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. The worthless son was offering to rescue the golden child from a situation he couldn't handle. Marcus accepted my offer in early May, eager to escape the regulatory nightmare he'd inherited. Chapter 12. Resolution. The property transfer was completed within 30 days. I used my savings, a loan against my future earnings, and ironically, the $50,000 inheritance Dad had left me to finance the purchase. Marcus walked away with enough money to pay off his debts and make a down payment on a suburban house far from any agricultural operations. Once I regained ownership of the family ranch, resolving the compliance issues became much simpler. My relationships with county officials and understanding of agricultural regulations allowed me to negotiate reasonable solutions for most violations. Several issues were resolved through operational changes that cost nothing but required agricultural expertise. Others were addressed through modest improvements that I could implement myself using skills developed over decades of ranch work. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA's Rural Relations Committee, found their complaints were no longer generating the same response from county officials. It turned out that many of their concerns were based on misunderstandings about normal agricultural practices, and my experience allowed me to demonstrate compliance more effectively than Marcus had been able to do. Within 6 months, the ranch was operating profitably again. I'd restocked with cattle, resumed normal operations, and even implemented some improvements that enhanced both productivity and neighbor relations. Marcus occasionally drove by the property, perhaps wondering how I'd managed to resolve problems that had seemed impossible to him, but he never stopped to talk, and I never reached out to explain. Some lessons are best learned through experience. Chapter 13, Full Circle. 2 years later, the ranch is thriving again. I've expanded operations, improved infrastructure, and even developed a good relationship with most of my Meadowbrook Estates neighbors. It turns out that clear communication and mutual respect can resolve most conflicts between agricultural and suburban communities. Marcus has moved on with his life, working in finance in another city. We exchange Christmas cards but rarely speak. I think he's happier in his suburban environment, away from the complexities of agricultural property management. Dad's vision of Marcus modernizing the ranch never materialized, but perhaps that was for the best. Some things are worth preserving exactly as they are, maintained by people who understand their true value. I often think about Dad's assessment of my worth and Marcus's potential. He wasn't entirely wrong. Marcus did have vision and ambition, but he lacked the practical knowledge and patience necessary to manage a complex agricultural operation, especially one facing regulatory challenges. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but the knowledge and experience gained through years of dedicated work. Dad never recognized that my decades of learning every aspect of ranch operations had prepared me to handle challenges that would overwhelm someone with less practical experience. The ranch is now debt-free and profitable, supporting not just my livelihood, but also providing employment for several local workers. It remains a working agricultural operation that contributes to our community's rural character while coexisting peacefully with suburban neighbors. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that worth isn't always measured in the ways we expect, and sometimes the best revenge is simply proving people wrong through quiet competence and perseverance. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more real-life tales of family drama, unexpected justice, and the surprising ways life can come full circle.